Hi, today I'm going to be going against Cynthia's claim that the Endangered Species Act is unnecessary for the protection of several species once on it. And her three secondary claims are listing of non-endangered species undermines the purpose of the Act, resources are being utilized inefficiently, resulting of the listing of no longer threatened species, and several species have a more appropriate level of protection in a different act. In response to her first claim, which is listing of non-endangered species undermines the purpose of the act, is she's not completely wrong, but when they were first placed on the list, the three animals that she first talked about, they are subspecies of other animals, and when they were first placed on the list, the researchers were unaware that they were subspecies of different animals, so the listing of the animals does not undermine the purpose because they were just unaware, and it was good that they were placed on this list because if they happened to actually be their own species and they weren't placed on the list to begin with, they could have been endangered or extinct at this point. So in response to her second claim, which is resources are being utilized ineffectively, resulting in the listing of no longer threatened species, is that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services oversees the listing and protection of land animals, plants, and freshwater fish, while the National Marine Fisheries Services oversees marine and fish wildlife. And she had stated that the judges were the ones that placing the animals on this list, but it's actually the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. So the judges don't really have a bias in what animals are going on the list. And also she states that there is a low success rate, and this is also not true because according to the agency of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, the agency estimates that there's a 98% of all of the species that are still surviving, and this statistic indicates that the Endangered Species Act is actually very effective. And the Endangered Species Act is the strongest law for protecting biodiversity passed by any nation, and its purpose is to prevent the extinction of our most at-risk plants, animals, and increase their numbers and affect their full recovery, and eventually remove them from the endangered species list. But I believe, and also according to my data, that the species do not need to be actually removed to prove the effectiveness of the act, because the point of the act is to protect the animals, not necessarily to remove them, and is trying to fix the biodiversity problem. And according to the Fish and Wildlife Services, if not for this act, 227 species would have gone extinct already. And with this act in place, only 10 have gone extinct, and 8 were already almost at extinction at the point when this act was created 42 years ago. And she also states that there are ineffective resources to track the threatened species, but there are actual ways to track the species, and these study methods are observation, photography, live trapping, and transect sampling. So the scientists go to the areas that are in question and do their best to estimate the animals found in the area, and then they compare these numbers that they have found to the minimum viable population number and decide if they're applicable to be put on the endangered species list. And she also stated that the list was too long, but the endangered species list has become so long because of other environmental issues that are happening in the world, not just that they're going extinct. And most of them are kept on the list as a precaution to make sure they don't go extinct in the future or have a chance of going extinct. And in response to her third claim, which is several species have a more appropriate level of protection in a different act, this is true because her example of the Mexican duck, she was stating that the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is more effective in helping, but the Endangered Species Act works with the same company, or it's the same services that are putting both of the acts on, so their main goal is to have a successful program and to save the animals and the environment. So it's not necessarily that they're trying to have two different goals, they're trying for the same thing. So, thank you.
All right, structurally, you identify the advocate's claims pretty clearly. On the first point, you talk about reasons why animals got on the act got placed on the list in the first place. You mentioned that sometimes it was a misunderstanding. It turned out that it was a subspecies. All of that information is asserted. I assume that you probably got it from someplace, but you're not attributing it in your speech. And then you basically say that it's good because otherwise they might have been eliminated. And again, there's no evidence on this particular point, at least not on this point. I think you do have some evidence down below that might apply to that particular idea. On the second point, when it comes to resources and how they're being distributed, there's not really a discussion of what resources are available and how they're being utilized. You just mentioned the two groups that are responsible for taking care of animal resources, and primarily the Fish and Wildlife Services is responsible for placing animals on the endangered species list. So I don't know how that addresses the resource issue. The argument that you make is that they seem to be doing a good job with the resources that they've been given because they've managed to keep the species that are on the list from going extinct, and you've got a good statistic on that particular point. You've got some evidence down below that says only 10 species have actually gone extinct, and 8 of them were already on the brink by the time they got on the list, so there wasn't much that they could have done. So this is a good argument that says that the Endangered Species Act has been relatively effective at preventing the loss of those species. I thought you did a pretty good job on that particular point. I'm not exactly sure what the contrast is with the advocate's position, except that there seems to be some implication that we have too many animals on the Endangered Species Act, and your argument basically comes back and says, well, it doesn't hurt to keep the animals there, even if they're no longer endangered, because it's like a double check, or it's safer for the animals in the long run. I say animals, I should say species, because it's not just animals. I know it's plants and other kinds of species as well. Excuse me. Your third point, I think, comes down to a simple idea that is not being expressed in the simple way possible, and that is that these two things are not mutually exclusive. There's no reason that both acts couldn't work simultaneously and continue to perform their function. So it's not really that because one act works more effectively, that doesn't mean that the other act doesn't work effectively. That seems to be the assumption that the advocate is making, and I think you want to challenge that and say that's not proven in this particular situation. And go back to your evidence on the effectiveness of the Endangered Species Act. I think it shows that it's been working pretty well, and that's the best response that you've got on your argument. All right, thank you.